Hello everyone, have a nice day. Today we'll follow Jack and TuTien as they rush to help Mom Ly, only to spot Mrs. Thu and watch her slip away in a taxi right in front of them. If you find it interesting, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. The taxi door slammed. TuTien caught the flash through the cafe window's first black coat, a streak of red, gold, glinting at the wrist, and her pulse spiked. Mrs. Ly shot up so fast her chair scraped the floor, coffee untouched, phone shaking in her hand. Mrs. Thu, Mrs. Ly cried. Stop. Outside, the woman didn't turn. She slipped into the back seat, pulled the door shut, and the taxi rolled forward like it had been waiting for this exact second. Mom, TuTien lunged after her. They burst into the cold, but the taxi was already sliding away down the gray road. Mrs. Ly tried to run, and TuTien grabbed her wrist before she stumbled into traffic. Get in the car, TuTien said, breath tight. Now, we'll lose her if we freeze. Mrs. Ly stared after the taxi, eyes burning, as if she could force it to stop with hatred alone. Hours earlier, the day had felt almost normal. Steam rose in the kitchen as TuTien served pho. Jack sat down, rubbing his hands, smiling into the bowl. It's cold today, he said. Eat while it's hot, TuTien replied, setting extra greens beside him. Jack took the first sip and softened. You always know what I need. They talked about small things, vegetables, and nearly ripe until Jack's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and stood. Mom, he said, voice already tense. TuTien watched his face change as he listened. Missus. Thu hasn't answered for days? Jack repeated, disbelief sharpening into concern. He paced a step, then asked, Where are you right now, Mrs.? Ly's voice spilled out, breathless and shaky. She'd called and messaged with no reply, even gone to the house, and the door was closed. Neighbors, said Mrs. Thu had been gone for 3 or 4 days. I'm with TuTien, Mrs. Ly admitted. She's driving me. I couldn't just sit at home. Jack's jaw tightened. Mom, stay in public. Don't go inside anywhere. Keep your phone on. I'm coming. He ended the call, grabbed his coat, and looked at TuTien. I'm going, TuTien said before he could object. Jack reached for her wrist, instinctively protective. I don't want you dragged into this. TuTien held his gaze, calm but firm. If it's about our family, I'm already in it. He exhaled, then nodded once. Fine, but you stay close to me, Mrs. Ly and TuTien started searching before Jack arrived. They drove along narrow roads, following directions to the old neighborhood. The gate was locked. The yard was silent. Mrs. Ly called out, then called the number again and again. Voicemail. Every time. She pressed her forehead to the phone for a second, like she could beg to sound into the line. Where did you go? They asked a neighbor grandma to sweep her yard. The door's been closed, the grandma said. 3-4 days. Mrs. Ly forced a polite smile. If you see her, please tell her Mrs. Ly is looking for her. Please. Back in the car, Mrs. Ly tried more numbers, Mrs. Liu, Mrs. Hi. The answers were all the same. No contact, no news. The silence began to feel deliberate. Finally, Mrs. Ly said, voice brittle. Drop me at the coffee shop ahead. I'll sit there and keep calling. Come back in an hour. TuTien didn't like it, but she drove her there and stayed nearby, watching from a few steps away, phone ready. She texted Jack the location. When Jack arrived, he moved with controlled urgency, eyes scanning the street, shoulders squared. He stood behind Mrs. Loy's chair, a quiet shield. "Mom," Jack said gently, "we handle this smartly. No rushing. No forcing doors." "Mrs." Loy's hands trembled around her phone. "She locked the door from the inside, Jack." "Inside? What does that mean?" Jack's eyes hardened. "It means she doesn't want to be found." He leaned closer, lowering his voice so only they could hear. "Tell me everything you know. Every name. Every place she mentioned. We trace it, step by step." "Mrs." Loy swallowed, trying to breathe. I just need to see her face. I need to hear her speak." TuTien reached for Mrs. Loy's hand, steadying it. "We will. But please stay with us." Jack nodded once at TuTien, grateful and tense at the same time. Then a shadow slid across the window. Black coat. Red inside. Gold flashing. "Mrs." Loy's head snapped up, eyes widening with recognition so sharp it looked like pain. "That's her," she whispered. Before Jack could move, "Mrs." Loy surged to her feet and screamed the name that had been haunting her for days. "Mrs." "Thu." Outside, the taxi door slammed, one clean, final sound, and Mrs. Thu escaped right in front of them. The taxi surged forward like a secret being swallowed by the road. "Mrs. Thu, Mrs." Loy's voice cracked as she stumbled off the curb. Jack moved instantly, one arm catching his mother's shoulder, the other hand shooting out to block her from stepping into traffic. His body became a wall without thinking, the way it always did when fear tried to take over the people he loved. "Mom, don't," he snapped, not angry, terrified. TuTien was already running, eyes locked on the taxi's rear window. For half a second, she thought she saw the woman inside glance back, just enough to confirm it was real. Then the glass flashed gray with the sky, and the car veered past the bend. "Get in," TuTien shouted. Jack pulled Mrs. Loy back toward their car. "Mrs." Loy fought like someone drowning, nails digging into Jack's sleeve. "She saw me, and she heard me running, Jack. She's running." "I know," Jack said through clenched teeth. "I know. Breathe. Stay with me." He shoved the passenger door open and guided her in, fastening the seatbelt himself because her hands wouldn't stop shaking. TuTien slid into the driver's seat, fingers flying for the ignition. The engine roared to life. Jack climbed in beside Mrs. Loy, turning his head to TuTien. "Follow her, but don't drive recklessly. If she wants an accident, we don't give her one." TuTien nodded hard. "I won't lose her." They shot out of the parking spot. The coffee shop shrank behind them, warm and useless now. Ahead, the road was narrow, lined with fences and fields, and the taxi's taillights flickered like a bad omen. "Do you see it?" Jack asked. "Yes," TuTien breathed. "Right there past the fork." The taxi cut left. TuTien followed, heart slamming against her ribs. "Mrs." Loy twisted in her seat like she could lean the car faster. "She's going to disappear again, Mrs." Loy whispered, voice breaking. "She's going to vanish and take everything with her." Jack grabbed his mother's trembling hand. "She already made one mistake." "Mrs." Loy looked at him, eyes wet and furious. "What mistake?" Jack's gaze stayed locked on the taxi ahead, but his voice dropped into that calm CEO tone, the one that meant he was already building the trap in his head. "She showed her face." TuTien swallowed. But if she gets to the highway? She won't, Jack said, and pulled out his phone. Vin? It rang once. Twice. Vin answered, startled. Boss? Listen carefully, Jack said, fast and controlled. We spotted Mrs. Thursday. She just fled in a taxi from a coffee shop area near her old neighborhood. Small roads, one fork leading toward the main route. I need you to contact Officer Thu immediately and send our location. Tell them she's mobile and heading toward the highway. Use the proper terms: CCTV, transaction papers, recipient name, mismatch everything. Don't change anything. Vin's voice sharpened. Understood. I'll call the police right now. Jack ended the call and turned to TuTien. Keep your distance. If she thinks we're desperate, she'll do something stupid. TuTien's knuckles went white on the steering wheel. She already is. The taxi suddenly braked hard. TuTien slammed the brake too, chest jolting. Their car stopped just in time. For one terrifying moment, the taxi sat there, motionless, like it was bait. Jack's blood ran cold. She wants us to hit her. Mrs. Ly let out a broken sound. She's playing with us. Then the taxi darted forward again, swerving right into a narrower lane. TuTien followed, jaw tight. She's trying to lose us in these alleys. Jack leaned forward, scanning signs, angles, exits. If she thinks she can outrun us, she's wrong. We don't chase with speed, we chase with proof. Mrs. Ly clutched her chest, trying to breathe. Jack? What if she gets away again? Jack squeezed her hand, then looked across the car at TuTien, his eyes softening for one brief second, like a vow passing between them. She won't, he said quietly. Not this time. Ahead, the taxi turned sharply into a crowded junction where motorbikes streamed like a river. TuTien swallowed, then pressed the horn once clear, controlled, trying to keep them moving without causing chaos. The taxi slipped through the flow. For a heartbeat, it vanished behind a truck. TuTien's breath stopped. Jack's voice cut through, steady and low. TuTien, eyes forward. Don't panic. The truck moved just enough, and the taxi reappeared, still running. TuTien exhaled like she'd been underwater. I see her. Jack leaned back, phone vibrating again with an incoming message, unknown number. He didn't answer. Instead, he looked at the taxi ahead, then at his mother shaking beside him, and finally at TuTien driving like her love depended on it. Outside, Tet decorations fluttered on roadside stalls, bright red against the gray sky. Inside the car, everything felt like a countdown.
Hello everyone, in this episode, Jack and TuTien start a cold-treated morning in a quiet home until Mom panics Mr. has vanished for days and wouldn't answer calls. TuTien drives Mom to Mr's old area, finding a locked house, and neighbors confirm she's been gone for 3 or 4 days. They regroup at the coffee shop and keep calling, and Jack arrives, steadying his shaken mother while planning a careful approach. Then TuTien spots a familiar black coat and a red inner outfit, and flashing roll outside the window. Jack's mom lost Mr's name, but Mr. slips into a taxi and escapes within seconds. Jack pulls Mom Ly back from danger. TuTien starts the car and they chase, while Jack calls to other officer to lock the net.